Now you try to come to grips with these destabilizations and covert actions saying like, how many? How much effect has this had on the world? How many people have died in these things? Obviously it's gross millions of people that have been killed in them. 1 million in the Korean War, 2 million in the Vietnam War. Noam Chomsky says a total of 4 million in Southeast Asia when you include the massive bombing of Laos and Cambodia, for example. 800,000 or so in Indonesia, 75,000 in the Ukraine, in which we had a partial responsibility in 1947, 26,000 in Hungary in the Operation Red Sox Uprising of 1956 that we encouraged, 20,000 in the Angolan operation that I helped to run, 15,000 in Nicaragua today. Gross millions of people that we have killed in our national security covert operations around the world. So you say, well, it's a tough world out there, so we've had to kill millions of people so we'll be safe and secure here in the United States. So you try to look at these things and say, what kind of people are these gross millions that we've killed? One of the first things that comes out to you is that since 1954, we do not parachute teams into the Soviet Union to brutalize people. Coincidentally, 1954, according to Tom Gervasi in his book, The Myth of Soviet Military Supremacy, is the first year the Soviet Union developed its first capability to drop an atomic weapon on the United States. We don't do these things in the Soviet Union for the simple reason they have the bomb and a huge army and they wouldn't put up with them. For different reasons, we don't seem to do these violent, gory things in England, France, Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, Sweden, Holland, Switzerland, Italy, etc. These gross millions of people that we've killed in these things are people of the Mitumba Mountains of the Congo, of the sands of the Western Sahara, of the hills of Angola, of the jungles of Southeast Asia, now the hills of northern Nicaragua. People who obviously don't have ICBMs or aircraft carriers or standing armies or navies with which to threaten our national security interests. Look at the people dying in Nicaragua for the last 5 years because of our glorious struggle against communism. These people down there, these 15,000 or so that have died, they're not Russian soldiers or advisors. They're not Cuban soldiers or advisors. They're not even percentage-wise mostly Sandinistas. They're mostly peasants, including many women and children. Communists, they're almost altogether Catholics. Enemies of the United States, the dozens of thousands of American witnesses who've gone down to visit with these people and in some cases live with them invariably come back up here and testify that these Nicaraguan peasants love Americans, love us if we'll just give them a chance. And so now we have the United States poised on the brink of its next war, the Central American War, as in the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Central American War. Now maybe we will be spared this horror, but we have had our own Secretary of State arguing for Contra aid this year, saying if we don't give aid to the Contras, they will have to do it with the U.S. Marines, and the Secretary of Defense arguing the same thing last year, so our government threatening the invasion of Nicaragua. Now this has been stopped, this invasion that was first advocated by Al Haig, Secretary of State in 1981. It's been stopped by the will of the American people. 70% of the people being polled as being against it, the government not being willing to try to take on such an invasion if it's so unpopular. Caspar Weinberger saying, not with my Pentagon, we won't support a war unless it's sufficiently popular that the soldiers can come back to some kind of honor instead of shame and castigation by the society. What he's really worried about is that the society would turn off the spigots flowing so much richesse into the Defense Department. Now this is not terribly reassuring, however, because leaders have outwitted the people throughout our history and the history of other countries. The people have many times been against wars, generally been against wars. The leaders who profit from them in different ways have been able to trick the people into wars. We are so carefully taught, we teach ourselves about how we are a peace-loving country. But if you read our own history just in a cursory way, you note that in fact we're a very warlike country. Over 200 times we've put our forces into other countries to force them to our will. We've been in the business of being a country about 200 years. We've spent 50 years at war. We've fought 15 major wars. The average amount of time between the end of one war and the beginning of another one is 10 years. I believe the longest period of time was between World War I and World War II, and during that period of time, in 1918, we put 12,000 troops into the Soviet Union. We invaded or occupied or put our troops into 12 other countries. We occupied Nicaragua for about 15 years. The American people successively have been taught to hate and fight the Seminole Indians, the Cherokee Indians, Mexico twice, the Plains Indians, the Filipinos, the Spanish Cubans, the British, the Germans, the Koreans, the Vietnamese, and now the Nicaraguans. Before each of these wars, there's been an orchestration of public opinion similar to what the government has been doing to this country against the Nicaraguans, against the Sandinistas. And in each case, there's been eventually some kind of a trigger that was used to galvanize public opinion, to mobilize people to support the war effort. The battleship Maine, the Lusitania, Pearl Harbor, the Gulf of Tonkin incident that was used to dramatize and justify going into the Vietnam War. Read Howard Zinn's book, if you haven't, A People's History of the United States, which gives you the quotes of the leaders throughout history as they have tried to get the people into a war mood and then eventually effected the triggers or exploited historic events and justified our going to war. Now it's been 22 years since the Gulf of Tonkin incident that justified the Vietnam War, 14 years since we pulled our troops back. So you've got to ask yourself, the country's overdue. This may be our second longest period of quote, peace. So are we in fact getting in a war mode? So you look about yourselves and you see it everywhere, of course. ROTC enrollment up, a gigantic U.S. government arms buildup, the greatest arms buildup in the history of the world, in fact, a militarization of the society, glorification of war. The glorification of war begins at the age of 2 in this warlike country of ours. As a matter of fact, does it not? When we put kids in front of the one-eyed babysitter and we turn it on and they watch 10 or 15 or 20 episodes a day of conditioning to the American syndrome. The American syndrome is where nice, clean, pretty, normally light-colored people are put upon by ugly, evil forces. They resist, they beg them to behave themselves, and then at the last minute desperately rise up and stomp the evil forces into the dust. The kids watch this thing, the American syndrome, 10, 15 times a year, growing up absolutely convinced that we are always the good guys, it's always someone else who's causing trouble, and we're fighting wars and intervening only desperately because they are in fact so evil. It's estimated that kids coming out of high school today have watched more hours of violence on television than they've spent in the classrooms themselves. And then you watch the films that we feed ourselves at a slightly older age. Rambo, Commando, Red Dawn, Under Siege, Delta Force, America Missing in Action, Top Gun, Heartbreak Ridge, Death Before Dishonor, Platoon, and they're still coming out. How many people saw the movie Red Dawn? Don't be embarrassed, it was a great movie. Nothing political about it, nothing propagandistic about it, right? This was the story, was it not, of how a force of Russians, Cubans, and Nicaraguans have conquered the United States, and they get all the way to the Rocky Mountains where they're eventually stopped by the high school football team.